Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to another great episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Cherokee Boos. Today we're going to be continuing our Project Plus, and our show here is going to be specifically focusing on how to execute and design our project schedules. If you've been following along, you know we've been looking at that for the past 2 episodes, but there are still some details that we want to cover. And with us today, we have Mr. Ronnie Wong to go ahead and head up those details. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for having me on the Project Plus show as we continue on to take a look at some of these details in developing our project schedule. Now, when we took a look before, we were talking about the idea of predecessors and dependencies. We showed you how you could use a tool like Microsoft Project to really kind of rail in or fence in all those details that we need to as a project manager to have them all in one location. And even though we talked about the idea of the predecessor relationship, we briefly mentioned the idea here of course, dependencies, and that they really go hand in hand, and we need to cover a few more details on dependencies and then move on to other topics to help us to determine what we call, of course, the critical path, which is something that we'll really have to kind of focus in on, and so we actually have those details ahead of us as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're talking about, and here we're just going to take a look at the idea here of some dependencies, and then we'll talk about what's actually on our screen as well. So whenever we have a task that's actually ahead of us, what we're going to end up seeing here is we're going to talk about the idea of early starts and early finishes, and then late starts and late finishes as well, and we'll move this into that realm of the diagram. Now, before we get here, we need to just take a little bit of time and focus in on dependencies just a little bit more. So let's go ahead and talk about those as well. Okay? Now, when it comes down to the dependencies, we showed you how you can create those types of predecessor relationships, but the problem that you and I might have is how do we know what's actually a dependent relationship and what isn't one? Okay? Well, there's actually multiple types of dependencies that you should be aware of, and that will help to allow you then to say, all right, here's how how as I set up these predecessors, what is dependent upon that task doing, and so we need to at least logically talk about that. So in terms of dependencies, there's actually 3 different types that we have to worry about. Okay? The first one is what we call a mandatory dependency, and a mandatory type of dependency is really when it actually depends on the type of work that's actually being done. Okay? So in this particular sense, work has to actually be completed before another one gets started. Well, in that sense, that means, hey, we really are. It's not an idea of I want it to actually be, where this finishes before this. It really has to actually be done before I can continue on. So let's give an example in terms of construction. Okay? I want to go ahead and frame up my house, okay, but I don't have a foundation poured so that a frame can be built on it. Well, in that sense, that's a mandatory dependency. That means before I can proceed framing up the framework for a house that I might want to build, the foundation must be finished and must be poured, and everything must actually be, completely cured the way that it has to. So that's an example of a mandatory type of dependency. Now, there's also, of course, what we call a discretionary type of dependency as well. In terms of discretionary dependency, this is some type of procedure-driven or process-driven dependencies. Now, I've mentioned this before in a previous episode, but we can go back to something like this where it might be regulatory as well. So in this example, I've actually used a friend of mine that used to build cabinets for airplanes, for private airplanes. And even though he could actually build all those cabinets and then install them into 100 airplanes at a time, he always had to wait after he finished building either the cabinet or the top surface of that cabinet. He had to wait until the inspector came by and inspected it and just simply signed off on his sheet. If he didn't get that sign off, he was not able to move on to the next step. Well, it's not that the signing off did anything, right? It was just signing a sheet of paper. It didn't actually do anything for the work being progressed along, but it was one of those discretionary dependencies that airplane manufacturers say, look, every single thing, right, because you're up in the air, you have to follow these procedures, and they wanted to make sure that everything was inspected as it went together on that airplane. So that was a discretionary type of dependency. Okay? We also have then external dependencies that we have to also begin to understand as well. Now, external dependencies are things that are beyond our control. Okay, so when we start taking a look at the idea of external dependencies that we have, well, let's go back to that example of the construction. Okay, so here it is. I've bought my piece of land, and now I am ready to frame up my house. The problem that I have, I've already told you, is I don't have the foundation ready to, or it's actually not there, so I need to wait for the foundation to be poured. So I go and I call whoever actually pours foundations. I say, all right, I want a foundation to be poured right now, okay? And they tell me, well, Ronnie, we can pour a foundation whatever size you need, but I need 24 hours in advance before I can do that, or I might need 48 hours in advance, whatever it might be, before I can come out and pour the foundation that you want. Well, that's an external dependency. In other words, I can't do anything because I'm actually dependent upon what? That person saying, I can deliver it either right now or I can deliver it in 24 hours. So in that sense, it's not anything you can control. It's pretty much the way that they have it, and so you might have to depend on those. So each one of those, knowing whether it's a discretionary, a mandatory, or even the idea here of an external dependency, is what's going to really help you set those predecessors up.
Yeah, and being able to identify those dependencies ahead of time, I mean, you're aware of any potential obstacles. You're just getting a heads up so you're not blindsided by any of these.
Yeah, and it really is. It's something that we definitely need to be aware of before we actually get into the execution stage of things. Because if it's at the execution stage and we're now worrying about dependencies then, while not in the planning stage, we're going to find ourselves really behind the 8 ball and we're not going to know what to expect. Now, the other things, of course, are fairly business-like types of things that we have to worry about in terms of scheduling as well, and then we'll get into the critical path method. One, of course, is understanding what the sequence of tasks that have to be done, and that's where understanding the predecessor and the dependency relationships really do help, but also understanding the time schedule. In other words, what is the overall time schedule that you have? You might find out something that your sequence is different if you actually are given a deadline and say, here's when it has to be completed by. You might actually sequence things a little bit differently to get you to that point where you know you can complete everything by that deadline date. Or it could be that they say, look, here it is. We want to make sure that you begin by this date so that we'll have it at some future date that we believe is going to happen. Okay? So you might schedule things out a little bit differently if you start from a start date instead and then say, let me figure this out in the planning stage of how long this is going to take, and I can give you an estimate. Well, that's a little bit different in the way that you're going to sequence your tasks to get things done. So when you use some type of project management information system, you'll end up seeing where they allow you to schedule from both. But once you do that, you're now setting into your schedule what they call, of course, a hard constraint if you're doing it from a project end date instead. And that means everything has to actually have a particular type of constraint called a finish on date. In other words, it has to actually be done this way for everything to be completed by this date. So you'll see it's one of the hardest constraints that you can work with because it means everything else has to be set around that to make everything work. So there's a lot of things that go on when you start taking a look at the idea of sequencing of tasks as well as the prioritizing of tasks too. So in terms of scheduling, there's a lot of considerations because you are literally scheduling so many moving parts, so many different pieces, so many elements you have to consider in terms of time before everything does come together for the work on your one project. So it's a lot of information that has to actually be done here, okay? All right, so in this sense then, we do have to just take a moment and start to go, all right, now that I understand all these elements, okay, that all this has to be in place, and I now have some durations that I can work off of, okay? What do I do with those durations, and how do I start calculating finish dates with them, okay? Well, the great thing is, in today's world, in the 21st century, heck, even in the latter half of the 20th century, you started to have the beginnings of those project information systems. In other words, you take all that information in, and you enter them into those project information systems, and you're off, and you're ready to go. But what if you don't have them, okay? What if you're now facing, let's say you're sitting down for an examination like the CompTIA Project Plus exam, And they show you this interesting looking chart here and say, hey, how do you actually determine what is the possible earliest finish date for this one task, or the latest finish date for this one task? Okay? Well, you have to be able to do something like that as well. And when we start to talk about that in project management terms, we're actually determining what we call the critical path of a project. And the critical path of the project is the longest uninterrupted run from the beginning to the end of that project, or that particular portion of the project, with no areas of float or the idea of downtime that we have in between. So that is what we're trying to determine. So that's where it brings us back to when we were taking a look at our diagram just a little bit before. Okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at my machine and let's see where it begins. Okay? Now, not everybody does this in the same way. Every once in a while you'll see this where people make bubbles or circles out of them instead, and that's perfectly fine. But this is kind of the easiest way, and this is the way that I learned how to do this method instead. So you normally just make a square, and in the upper left-hand corner, you have your earliest start. Now, we're actually talking in terms of duration. Okay? So notice the D here is for duration, and then we have our earliest start date, and then we have our earliest finish date. Now, we're going to just use simple numbers instead of real dates at this point because it can get confusing, but we'll show you how this is done. And then we're also going to determine the latest start and the latest finish that this particular task can take and help us out. All right? So that is what we actually need to determine. Now, any time that once we actually get finished going through and determining the earliest start and earliest finish, the latest start and the latest finish here, when we start to do that, our goal is to determine this idea that we call float, okay? Or if you actually come from the Microsoft project world, they call it slack, is what they call it. In other words, that time that it actually is a gap in between that we really don't know, why everything's not actually lining up to finish one thing after another, but it actually ends up happening in our project schedule, and we are going to take a look at this. The reason why we have to know this idea is because what you're going to end up finding out is that not everything in a project will progress in a linear format. Okay? And that means that what you might find out is that two tasks that actually began as a single work package might actually end up splitting into two tasks and then end up coming back together for the next task to go on, and they're going to end up being dependent on one another, and so they're going to affect each other's end dates is what's going to end up happening. So let me show you an example of how we begin to calculate something like this out. So the way that we do this, and let me make this screen a little bit easier to see, at least I hope we can.
Yeah, what's going on here?
All right, so what is going on right here, okay, is that we're going to start off with task A, and notice there's a B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I. Okay, what you're seeing at this point is that it began with task A, but now it's going to actually end up splitting off into two possible directions. In other words, both of these have to be done before the entire that particular work package or branch can be finished. Okay, so we need to actually determine how long each one of these packages will take place so that we can begin to schedule them. Okay, if we are going to do this. Now, the way that we begin is that notice that underneath task A, as well as all the other lettered tasks that we have a number. And that one right there in the center is going to be what we call the duration of our task. Okay? So when we start to figure this out, we're going to make two passes. Okay? One is what is called a forward pass, and that is when we actually run through the calculation from this way. Okay? In other words, we're going to actually run through it from left to right. And then the other one, well, is what we call a backward pass. And that will actually help us when we actually run through it in this particular direction instead. So we're going to actually see both of them in action, and then we can determine float from actually using this here. Okay? So let's see how that's actually done to help us out. Now, the math is going to seem a little bit different than the way that you and I normally do math. It's not because it's the arithmetic, it's the way that we have to count duration. Okay? So let's take, for an example, task A here. It's supposed to actually be a task that, let's say, lasts 1 day. Okay? So if we were to talk about that 1 day task here, well, the earliest day that I can start on this task is going to be, well, 1 day. Okay? So in that sense, if I take that 1 day, and I'm saying that that particular task lasts 1 day, it's going to finish, well, at the end, excuse me, of day 1. Okay? So if a 1-day task takes a whole 1 day, that means it actually finishes on that same day. Okay? So just bear with me on this if you're going, okay, that hopefully so far makes sense. So that means that the earliest possibility that task B can actually begin, depend on the dependency here, which for us is going to be a finish to start dependency. Task A finishes, and notice the arrow, okay? On the finish side, right, the right-hand side here of this task, going to what? The beginning, or the start side of this task. So this is a finish to start relationship. That means that the earliest that task B can begin is going to be, well, on day 2, okay? So if the earliest that task B can begin, and that task's duration is supposed to take 2 days, well, that means it's actually, if we use dates, right? So if this began on January 1st, a 1-day task should also end on what? January 1st. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Then the earliest that task B can begin should be January 2nd.
Ending on January 4th.
You would think that. That's exactly what that's what I was hoping would happen. I'm hoping trick Cherokee here. And yeah, because how? You and I count what? That means that if we start on 2nd, that means 2 days later is what? 3rd and 4th.
Right.
Okay. But you're forgetting that if we begin at the beginning of what? Day 2, there's an 8-hour workday there. That's day 2. There's 1 day.
Okay.
And then day 3 is actually our 2nd day. Okay, because you actually have another 8-hour day.
Okay.
So the earliest finish here is day 3.
Okay.
Because we're actually doing work on what? The 2nd and the 3rd. Make
Yes.
sense?
Yes.
So 2 days. All right. So notice that we're following this pattern then. So the earliest that task C can begin is the day after, because I'm at the end of here, right? I'm at the end of the finish of the business day of day 3. So then the earliest finish date right here is day 4. Or start date, excuse me.
Okay.
Start date, my fault.
You already have me confused. You're telling me that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4
I
anymore.
know.
So.
Yeah, this is where durations matter,
All right.
because the way that we're calculating, right, is not at the end of the business day, but it's at the beginning. See, when
Okay.
we count, right, we always count from the end of that number and go
you would
up.
think, yeah, but no.
That's what you would think. Okay, but notice that that's not the way that this one works here.
I see.
So now, if we actually start on the 4th, we count what? The 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, right? That's 4 days.
Correct.
Okay, so this would actually end on the 7th. So far, so good?
Yes.
All right. All right, so Cherokee, here it is. I'm going to throw you under the bus, okay? So if this actually finishes, task C ends up at the end of day 7. So we're done with all of day 7. What's the earliest that task D can begin?
This one is going to be day 8.
8.
I know, it's so weird. I just want to make sure.
No, I'm with you. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm with you. So we begin at the day of day 8. Now, if we begin the day of day 8, right, Cherokee?
Right.
Have I done any work so far?
Not yet.
Not yet. So that means that if it's a 3-day task, I have all of
Day
8.
starting
So
the
January 8th.
The 9th,
Ninth,
and then the 10th.
and
That
the
should be
10th.
my EF
Yep.
finish.
So on the 10th here, okay, so that's what we should end up seeing. At least I think that that's right, okay? So there is that idea where we actually do finish that way. Well, that means that the final task over here, what do you think on task I?
Task I.
Yep.
I'm going to say 11.
You'd be wrong.
What's going on here?
Oh, yeah. See, notice that we didn't hit the bottom half, right?
I
Notice-
was wondering about
See?
that. Is it happening in tandem, or is there something else going on?
Yeah. So at this point, the way that it's showing, it is happening in tandem, okay? So in other words, we are actually seeing this. And so this particular or task on I, right, we don't know which of these two arrows here is actually going to affect what? The beginning date of I. We don't know yet. Why? Because I haven't determined what? The bottom path.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yes, but are you saying also that one of those paths may have a higher precedence than the other, like your prioritization?
Not precedence, but let's see how this works out. At least I hope
Okay.
this is going to work out. All right. So now let's start with E here, okay? So if we actually now go through 1-1, that means on task E, day 2,
Correct.
okay? So day 2, a single day task, so that would be January 2nd. That should also end on
The 3rd.
the 2nd. Yeah. Remember that we
That's
start
right,
at the
that's
beginning
right.
of the, yeah, I'm just, just trying to make sure, okay? Because I can do math wrong just as easily, okay?
No, you're
so,
right.
So then, task F, the earliest day that it can begin is at the end of day 2, which is actually what? Day 3.
3rd.
Okay? So the 3rd. And this one has 5 days, okay? So we count the 3rd,
Day 3, 4,
fourth,
5, 6, 7.
6th, and 7th. Yeah, I had to count slower. See, Cherokee's so much faster in her mind than I am. So it is at day 7 here, okay? So now that means task G, the earliest that that one can begin,
I can't even see that number.
is 8.
0. Oh, that's an
8.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an 8. Yeah. Here, let me zoom in. There we go. Can you see
Okay,
that one now?
that's better.
All right. So task 8. Okay, or task day 8. So January 8th. It's a 4-day duration. All right, Cherokee, help me out here. 8.
8, 9, 10, 11.
11. So here's 11. Let's see if I can scoot on over here. Okay. So that means that at the end of day 11.
Which we've already surpassed the previous track.
Oh, we've already surpassed the previous track here. So this means that this can actually, H here has to be going on day 12, and it can finish when?
And this is a 1 day, so it can also finish on the 12th.
On the 12th here, okay? So now, this is where we have what? Information. I have day 10, and I have day 12, okay? Task I is dependent upon both, okay, right?
Okay.
Remember, the start to finish relationship says what? That task I can what?
Begin once my other tasks are complete.
Yes, once the other task, the preceding task is complete. Now, that means that if I start this on the 11th, right? If I start I on the 11th, what happens to H?
You're going to be behind the ball. You're not going to be ready for whatever you need for that task I.
Yeah, so this is where now we start seeing where both paths have an influence on one, right?
Correct.
Okay. So that means I have to come back now and say that the earliest then that task I can begin, because I've finished now what? The end of day 12.
Mm-hmm.
This is what?
The 13th.
13th. Okay. So now that we have the 13th, which means 1 day task can also end on the 13th as well. Make sense?
That does.
All right. So now we've actually made the forward pass here, and we're starting to see some information pop in. Okay. Now we have to do the other one to determine which one has float, because that's the area that we can actually adjust the schedule and not really actually influence the overall schedule as well. Okay. So if we make any adjustments, and we need to, we try and put it in that area in which we'll find gaps in. Okay. So that's what's going to happen.
Ronnie, should I be prepared to see these types of questions on the exam, or be able to identify when these, these toll gates or these tasks should be completed by?
Yes.
Okay, just so I know.
Yes. Now, don't get me wrong. Are they going to actually make you do the whole thing? I can't tell you that. Okay. There's reason why I can't tell you that, but I can't tell you. But what I can tell you is at least I would be prepared to understand how this works. Okay. Both the forward and the actual backward path, and then something else we're going to show you here at the end. All right, so let's work on the other end, okay, going through here, okay? So now we're going to start with task I here. And so that means that on the bottom half, right, we're talking about late start, late finishes here. The latest that this task can actually finish is going to be the 13th, okay? That's because we've already seen that, hey, that's the final date. And that means that for this one, it can actually, well, begin on what day? The 13th. Oops. All right. Let me see if I can zoom back out here. All right. So we'll take the top half again and we'll go on through. Okay. So now, if we go to D, that means that the latest that this particular task can finish, right? If I know that the latest that it can start is the 13th here, this would be 12, day 12. And then we actually do the same thing going backward, right? So for me to determine the early finish, right, day 12, 11, 10. So this should be day 10, okay? Then that means that the earliest that this one can finish should be 9, if I'm right, okay? Yeah. if I'm right here. So 9, 8, 7, 6, I think, if my, here. And then day 6, the earliest that this one will finish is going to be, oh, wait, make sure I said that. 9, 8, 7, 6, yeah, that's 4, right. So this should be 5 here. And then this one here is going to be, what is it, 5 and 4, right here, unless I did some math wrong, which I could have. Let me verify that I actually did that right. Okay, so here, day 13, we subtract 1 day, and that then we take 10 here, day before, 6, 5, 4, 2, yep, there we go. And now I have to actually wait on this one too, right? Because I don't have what? The other one down here. So even though these numbers may be different, I may find out something it's not going to actually work out the way that I want to. All right. So now we actually start down here at the same thing with H. And then we'll finish this up right here. This will be 12 and 12, which means that this one will actually have 11, right? And then we take away 4, so 11, 10, 9, 8. And then the earliest that this one can finish is going to be, or latest it can finish is going to be day 7, so that day 8 can actually begin. So we subtract 5 from that. So 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, right? That's
Yes.
5. Okay. Just one, again, I'm not as fast as Cherokee. I'm kind of slow here. That means that this one's going to be 2. And then that same day, 2 here. Oops, let me scroll back. And now, between the both of these, okay, what is the latest finish that I can have for these two? Well, the latest one that I can have is actually 2 here, okay, because, well, that doesn't actually, I can't do this backward where I say this starts on day 4 when this one's supposed to start on what day, or latest start is on day 2 here. So it's here that this takes precedent where this becomes a 1, and then a day 1, oops, is right here. All right. Now, what you might see, right, is not the whole thing. In other words, on the exam, you might not have to fill out the whole thing. But what if they were to leave like 2 of these blank? Like they were to say, you need to, oops, you need to erase the whole thing. Let's say that they actually said this, and they said, determine this, okay? Yes, they do expect that you can do that. Okay, it's very possible, okay? Or they may ask you to determine which of these has float in them. Now, that's where it's actually a little bit easier. I say a little bit easier here, a little bit more here. And the way that we determine float is here. We take the late start and we subtract the early finish, and wherever we get a difference, there's float, okay? So let's just do a couple of them in the time that we have remaining here, okay? Well, notice here at the very end, I went ahead and determined this one, because the late start and late finish subtracted from the late start, I'm going to get that right, that's 0. Okay, same thing. Early start or early finish and early start, 0. There's no float. Same thing here for task H. As I try and, there we go, for task H, that becomes a 0. And notice this whole bottom here has no float in it, okay? So if you actually do this, where you subtract, where you take a look at all these numbers and they're essentially identical, you won't have any float time. Okay, it's just not going to happen. But notice here, though, you do have float here. Okay, because I can see 8 and 10, there's a difference here, and then 10 and 12, there's a difference here. There's going to be float there, and that's going to be like 2 or 3 days. Same thing here. There's going to be float along here, and then there's float here, okay? On this one, we're not going to actually determine that, because there's no float there, okay? So this one's actually going to be 0. So all of those other numbers, they actually will determine days of float. So there's 2, let's say that there's 4. Actually, we'd subtract them out to do that. So here it would be, let me make sure I'm telling you right. So late start minus early start, okay? So late start, early start, this is 2 days, okay? So this one right here, late start minus early start, 2 days. This one, same thing, so 2 days. Now, what does that help you determine? Well, it lets you know that if you affect anything up here in terms of a extension to the project duration by a day, or a day here, or a day here, it's not going to affect the overall project. If you need to affect the project, it's down here where there's no room for anything to adjust before you affect the end date of that project, or the end result over here. So you're actually determining that. This path down here at the bottom is my critical path because all of my float is gone. There's
Less
no wiggle
wiggle
room.
room.
Yep, there's
Exactly.
no wiggle room.
That's what I was thinking.
Yep. So that is what you're actually starting to see right there when you start to do that. So this is a skill that most of us are probably never going to have to do in reality, but on the exam, you got to at least know how to determine something just like I showed you and the idea of float here to understand. Okay? So there's a lot of information right there. It's probably a great place for us to at least kind of take a breather and just trying to soak that in.
And that's one of those things, kind of like subnetting, right, Ronnie? You just got to practice it in order to become fast so that you're not stressing out during that exam.
Yeah.
But
No, you're right. The very fact is, like I said, they're not going to give you like a whole thing like this, okay? It's probably going to be elements from a single one the majority of the time. Again, I can't exactly tell you. One, I'm not allowed to. But two, I really don't know. But overall, though, just kind of realize if you can determine float, if you know how to actually determine where you can actually find that, that's going to be great. Determine an early start date or a late start date or early finish, early start, all that stuff. Make sure you can do all that. And you might find yourself right there and they're going to say, oh, yeah, that's what he can do. And that's actually a good thing for us. So it's a good skill for us to have just in case we don't have that project management information system where we can get access to it.
so, Ronnie, this has been a lot of information we've looked at so far, but we're not quite done. We have a couple more topics that we need to address. We need to look at our quality gates and our governance gates. Do you think you can help us out with that?
Sure can. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of last topics here on project schedules that will really round out what we need to understand as well. Now, Cherokee mentioned those two specific ideas of what we call gates, and there's some specific types of gates that we need to make sure that we understand, which are called quality gates and governance gates as well. So let's take a look at my machine here, and that will help us out just a little bit, okay? Well, either one, whether we're talking about quality gates or the idea of governance gates here, well, there's specific types of go, no-go types of decisions. You might hear the term project gate, milestone, whatever it might be, that's pretty much the idea here, okay? Now, in your project, there can be many of them, or there might just be a few of them. With quality types of gates, what we're actually saying is that we establish certain times within our project where what we say is that we check the quality of what the work is, and if the work continues to meet that benchmark, okay, that is when a decision is made by someone, okay, whether it's the project manager, project team, sponsor holder, or project sponsor holder, project sponsor that says, all right, we're going to continue on with this because this is what I'm looking for. But this allows us to put in those early warning systems, okay, that says, yes, we still find value in this work. Projects can be very easily lost at the very end once you spent all the money for your project and now your company is down. Well, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars as well. For a small company, let's say it's $50,000 to $60,000 and you worked on the whole project and now somebody says, yeah, this is not up to snuff. Well, what happens to all the money? You can't recoup that very easily. So setting up what we call, of course, quality gate says, here's where we're going to do a quality inspection, and then we'll decide whether or not we're actually proceeding on with what we need to. It's very important, okay, because if we don't have these quality checks, we could produce a dud at the end and say, well, I did all the work for it. You still owe me to finish that. And somebody at the end says, you did all the work, but I'm not paying you for that because I don't like it at all. That would be terrible. So setting up quality gates is actually a very good thing that can be put in place that checks on the quality. The same idea is pretty much identical in terms of governance gates, but this time it is how we've actually chosen for that procedure to go on. So this is more procedural in this sense. So what we want to do is we want to actually know whether or not the management is still actually involved in what we do here, okay? So this actually gives us certain times within our particular project instead that says, look, somebody can say, I don't really agree with this anymore, or whether it's legislative at this particular point, whether it's management, client signing off, whatever it might be, that we just don't have everything that we need and in the project as well. So both of these types of gates here, okay, are really just saying there's different types of markers that we need to make sure of. And what we don't want, again, is at the very end of the project for somebody to finally say, yeah, we should have scrapped that 2 weeks ago, and we just chose not to. So it allows us to stop it at any point without expending any more money. And these are really good ideas, okay? So setting those gates up during planning, of saying, here's where I want to check, is actually a manager's best friend, because it allows him, if everything's not working the way that it needs to, that he can now go ahead and cut off that particular point and move on to a different project if he needs. So setting these gates up are great ways to actually provide very good solid metrics and a point that says I'm accountable up to this point, and then after that we're done if we actually need to be, or I'm continuing on with the management of this project as well. So that's what we talk about when we take a look at governance gates as well as quality gates.
Well, thank you, Ronnie, for explaining that to us and everything else you've covered in this episode. We've taken a look at our dependencies, our mandatory, our discretionary, external. We also looked at how to prioritize and sequence tasks, in addition to determining our critical path. So I think we're good to go for this episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. I'm Cherokee Boos.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
Signing off. Have a great one.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.